Welcome to Performance Car Lounge, where each week we speak with enthusiasts selling their beloved performance cars. This week, we speak with the seller of a South African Ford Fairmont GT. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Performance Car Lounge podcast. This week we have a really interesting story back from a time when Ford were basically manufacturing Ford GTs in Australia and then flat packing them and sending them to South Africa where they were reassembled. And today's guest is the owner of one of these South African Fairmont GTs. It's a XW Fairmont GT, and we're joined by Brendan today. Hi, Brendan.
G'day, Stuart. How you going?
Very well, thank you. So tell us a little bit about your particular Fairmont GT.
Oh, look, Stuart, I've owned the car for around 10 years now. I grew up in basically a Ford family. So my dad was very much into Fords. I'm the youngest of three boys in the family. So I grew up, my eldest brother owned a beautiful Australian XW Grecian Gold GT. My middle older brother owned a beautiful Nugget Gold XY GT. And then, of course, I grew up and in my younger days, when I had black hair, I owned two XB GTs, which were beautiful cars in themselves. They weren't quite XYs or XWs. But then, of course, you know, the younger days go and work and family get in the way. So those cars went for a long time. And probably 10 years ago now, or longer than 10 years ago now, probably 12 or 13 years ago, I started to think about owning another GT,
Yep.
reliving those days. And I quickly became aware, if you think about 13 years ago and the prices that Australian GTs were bringing, it became apparent fairly quickly that that was not going to be affordable. So
I think it was a Phase 3 GDHO, a 71 model, I think, that fetched $750,000 at auction not too long ago. So, yeah, it's probably
I
not
think there's been,
attainable.
no, that's true. I think there's been a few that have gone past the million mark. And
Oh, wow.
so, yeah, that became apparent that it was not going to be affordable. So then I don't know how I found out, but somehow I heard about exactly what you said in the intro about around that time, Ford manufacturing GTs out of Broadmeadows and then shipping them out to South Africa in complete knockdown form. And that they'd set up assembly plant in Port Elizabeth in South Africa and were doing the final assembly of those cars to be sold there. So I found out about that. Did a bit of research about, you know, those cars, some of those cars coming back to Australia, you know, and that they were probably more affordable options. And so, yeah, I saw one that was advertised. I looked at a lot. I guess. And I probably had my heart set on an XY GT, I guess. Maybe most people do. And I probably looked for a couple of years before finally I saw a car that was advertised, which is the one that I eventually bought. And it was in the western suburbs of Melbourne. And the guy had put it up. He was fairly reluctant, I think, to sell it. But over a course of a couple of months, we ended up doing the deal, and I've had it ever since, and it is an amazing car. The XWs are slightly different. They're just something a bit different from the XY GTs. The South African XY GTs, they look, for all intents and purposes, fairly similar to the Aussie XYs.
The biggest differentiator in appearance is probably the shaker scoop from the Mark 1 Mustang at the time is on the XYs, isn't it? Where the
Yep.
XWs don't have that shaker scoop.
No, they don't. They have an air intake in the bonnet, but which is similar to the Aussie GTs as well. But yeah, the XYs, the South African XYs look fairly similar, whereas the XWs, there's something just a little bit different. they obviously had most of them had vinyl roofs, and my understanding is that vinyl roofs in those days in Australia weren't a particularly desirable option. So there must have been a lot of stock of vinyl roofs out of Broadmeadows, and they shipped them all over to South Africa and fitted those in Port Elizabeth. They came with the Aussie GS hubcaps. So there weren't ever five slot rims on South African cars. But the XWs were a little bit different in that they also had the Aussie GS stripe, side stripe. So they weren't the big wide stripe like the Aussie XW GTs.
Yes.
And then where the 351 high performance badge was on the Aussie front guards, these were fitted to the rear of the stripe on the rear quarter panel. So they're just a little bit different. And I've taken mine to numerous car shows, and you can sort of see people looking at them, Stuart, saying, what the heck is this?
Yes. Yeah.
Is it a modified Aussie GS or, they're just not quite sure, but it's actually just an original South African XW GT.
So to put it into context, the Falcon GT was introduced in 1967 as the XR series, and that came through with a 289 cubic inch Mustang V8. And then the XT was later introduced that saw the 302 Windsor V8 in those cars. And then
Yep,
coming to your car, we saw the XW, which saw the 351 cubic inch Windsor V8 in the XW series. And with that, we saw the car competing at Bathurst at the Hardy Ferodo 500 in 1969.
yep,
And a privately driven XW GDHO, which was driven by Bruce McPhee and Barry Mulholland, claimed second outright, which is pretty impressive. So I believe the demand for these GT Fairmonts in South Africa was very strong, given the racing success of the GDHOs, those Bathurst events. And
yep.
I think at the time it was probably one of the highest output power cars for a four-door and one of the fastest cars in the entire world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, no doubt that it was, popular in South Africa. But yeah, as you said, Ford Australia were basically building the cars on the Fairmont assembly line in Geelong, and then
Yep.
basically they said they did a complete knockdown version of it, and they painted it in red oxide paint to protect it
Correct.
from rust, I guess, for its voyage across the
Correct.
ocean uh,
Correct.
to South Africa, where it was reassembled locally there it was basically a complete car with some local content from South Africa.
You can still see some of the red oxide on my car.
Yeah, right. That's
It's
cool.
amazing. It is.
Do we know what why didn't Ford Australia just send the cars completely manufactured? Was it a policy from the South African government that they wanted to provide jobs for local employment, or was it simply a cheaper way of doing things?
Probably like all things, Stuart, there was probably definitely a political element to it. And my understanding is that it's another reason that sets these cars apart. In that, my understanding is that there was a local requirement to have, even though they were sent across in complete knockdown form, that there had to be a percentage element of locally manufactured content.
Yeah,
So this is again something that makes these cars stand out. For instance, the glass in them is South African glass. So the windscreen, all the side windows, the rear windscreen is actually stamped South Africa.
yep.
It's not, I think the Aussie GTs had Pilkington glass in them, and these don't. And they're all stamped. So that's probably an example of, a government decisions, that there had to be a percentage of locally manufactured content.
And it's also interesting that they called it the Fairmont GT as opposed to the Falcon GT. I believe that there
Mm.
was already a Falcon on sale in South Africa. They were importing them US cars, manufactured cars from Canada, and that's why
Correct.
they chose the Fairmont name. And there's also some rumblings that those cars weren't very good quality, those Falcons. So they chose to shift away from the Falcon nameplate that was used in Australia and instead use the Fairmont nameplate, which, as I understand it, it actually might be more accurate because the Falcon GTs of the time that were built in Broadmeadows for Australia were actually built on the Fairmont assembly line.
Correct. Similar interiors, etc. So there were probably a lot of people say that they were more aligned to a Fairmont than to a Falcon anyway. So
And all the running gear was essentially exactly the same. And Ford Australia has even confirmed that the South African assembled GT in Port Elizabeth was an exported Falcon GT. So it's surprising to me that there's such a huge differential in the asking prices for these cars.
yeah, I mean, I think prices probably, particularly in the last 8 years or so, Stuart, have risen. I think in South Africa, particularly, so for a couple of reasons. One is they're becoming extremely rare. So a lot of those cars have already come back to Australia. And I think South Africa, has woken up that these are really desirable cars. And when you were talking before, Stuart, about, the desire for those cars in South Africa, I mean, yeah, probably there was some influence from the racing pedigree in Australia, but I think probably also my understanding is that they were used as tow vehicles because they had big V8 engines that a lot of them were used for pretty hard going towing. So
Yeah.
some of those cars, the pretty rough conditions over there as well, lots of dirt roads, etc. So a lot of those cars were probably knocked around, quite a bit. Mine's probably a really lucky one in that it's a very original and a really nicely kept car. So I think in some ways mine's a bit of an exception. The other
Yeah.
thing is that those XWs GTs that Ford exported from Australia, it was almost an experiment for the first initial batch. So the XWs, they actually only did, I think, about 238 cars in total for the XW model.
Yeah.
Now, it was successful, and so they then expanded that, and I think they did about 1,400 XYs. So the XY, there are definitely more XYs around,
Yes.
but it also makes the XWs a really rare car. When you think that only 238 were done, it's actually a rarer car than an Aussie Phase 3 GT.
You're right. I was doing some research and it looks like with the XW variant that the South Africans actually even purchased more of those than were sold in Australia. Approximately 1,800 South African GTs were supplied
Yeah.
versus 1,557 Aussie GTs. I'm not sure if those numbers are entirely correct. It's always hard with the older cars to track the
Yeah.
exact numbers, but what you're saying is very true. Your car is one of probably less than 240. So yeah, very
Yeah.
big car.
Well, my understanding is that, there's probably, people are saying that there's probably less than, 100, 150 of those XWs actually left now. And to find a good one, is definitely fairly rare.
Yeah, I mean the temptation over the years to fiddle with them and change them must have
Yep.
been massive. So
Yep.
to find a car that's,
Yeah.
original and stock is unique.
Yeah. And to have it, it's actually still got the original 351 in it. And it doesn't look like that engine has ever been out of the car. So yeah, it's a beautiful car.
It's definitely a stunning car, and I can't believe the condition it's in. If you are listening to this podcast on one of the streaming services, head to the performancecarlounge.com.au website where I'll have all the photos of the car. You can check it out. I'll also have a link to the ad. So if you are interested in finding out more about the car, you can get in touch with Brendan. Brendan, I believe in South Africa, the Fairmont GTs were affectionately known as the Rhinos. Did that apply to the XW as well as the XY?
I'm honestly not sure. I assume it does, Stuart, in the way that the XW was the first Aussie car, Aussie GT, to wear that Subaru badge, if you like. So they were the first of the Larry stripes, I guess, on the Aussie GTs. So I think all of the XW and the XY South African GTs are often, affectionately referred to as Super Rhinos.
which I think is pretty cool. That South Africa has the
It
black
is.
rhino, the white rhino, and the GT rhino as well.
Correct, correct.
I'm sure you're familiar with this website. In researching for this podcast, I came across a website called safairmontgt.com.au. And for anybody who's interested in finding out more about these South African Fairmont GTs, this is a really interesting site that's been put together by a fellow who was actually looking for a car that his dad owned. So it was originally owned in South Africa, and this fellow now lives in Melbourne. And he says on the website that he's actually now driving Holden V8s, but don't hold it against him. He wants to buy back his dad's car, so he's looking for a red XY Fairmont GT. It's got the shaker. He says it was purchased from Grosvenor Ford Pinetown in South Africa, and it was traded in eventually for a Mercedes. He thinks it had the vinyl roof that we mentioned before. So if you are listening to this podcast and you think you know something about that car, head to safairmontgt.com.au and get in touch with this fellow. You might be able to help him reconnect with his dad's car. Brendan, tell us a bit about your experience driving the car. Like, what have you done during your ownership? How have you driven it?
Look, it was already, Stuart, in really nice condition when I got it. I've just tidied things up, really, just made sure that all of the gauges were working. I've been through the suspension with it to make sure that it drives nicely. I've set up the front end. But basically, it is just absolutely stock standard. I'm not sure whether you guys are aware of this, but they came standard with the XWs came standard with a 2V 351.
Yeah,
And my understanding is that they were the cars were exported from Broadmeadows to South Africa, but without the motors. So my understanding is that the engines for the cars came to Port Elizabeth in South Africa direct from the US. They were crate motors essentially. So that's my understanding. Mine is the original engine in that car, which to me sets that car apart again. So the other thing is too that the car's fairly rare. Not sure whether you intended to talk about this, but they painted the cars obviously over in Port Elizabeth, and they didn't paint them the same color as the Aussie GTs. So,
I was going to ask you
yeah,
about that. I think the
yeah,
color of your car I love it because it just speaks to the period it comes from. It's such a period correct color, for want of a better term. So yeah, can you tell us about the color? What do you know what they called it?
the color is called Wimbledon White, which was not an Aussie GT color.
Yeah,
Nor were I think any of the colours on the South African GTs. My understanding is that they were UK based colours. So there's Ford Cortinas, that I've looked up from that era that were painted Wimbledon white. I think it is also a Mustang colour.
I
I'm
think
not
you're right.
sure how that really ties in. So it's that sort of creamy sort of white color.
Yeah,
But to me, it's just another thing that that makes the cars just a little bit different. And I love that. For me, it's got to that Mustang connection because, you know, I don't think there are any Aussie GTs that had a burgundy or like a red interior. And this has a red interior. So to me, it's got that almost another link to that muscle car era with, the white and the red interior. And
it's
and
such a good
when I
combination, and the
it's a
interior of your
beautiful
car just
combination.
looks beautiful.
Yeah.
The combo is fantastic.
Yeah, it's a great combination. And look, to be honest with you, because I grew up as a young guy, around Aussie GTs, and I saw this car advertised and I thought, oh my God, it's got a red interior. I'm not sure I can live with that. And so really I drove out, it was a few hour drive, but I drove out primarily to see whether I could live with a red with a red interior. And then of course got out there, Stuart, and absolutely fell in love with the whole combination of the white and the red interior.
I can see why. So, have you done much driving in the car? Is it I'm sure it's not been a daily driver. Is it something that you've taken to car shows and taken for a Sunday drive?
Absolutely. So we get in it. My wife and I get out in it every sunny day, every sunny weekend,
Yeah.
and we'll often just go for a drive for a coffee. There is a local car show that happens over the summer months, so it normally goes to that show as well. Yeah, we get out in it quite regularly. It's done a few weddings, which always attracts a bit of attention as well.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, it's definitely been used, never as a daily driver. And look, I'd be honest and say it's never really been out in the rain either, which my mechanic really laughs at that because he said probably in its time in South Africa, it probably never saw a sealed road. It was probably all dirt roads, etc. And now it doesn't go out in the rain. So
I think you're right. In South Africa, what you mentioned before, they were really good towing vehicles, and that fellow who
yeah,
started the South African Fairmont GT site, remember one of his memories is his dad pulling a boat up the hill, and he remembers the sound of the V8 as he pulled the boat up the hill. So a car that sounds as good as it looks as well, which is very cool.
yeah, absolutely.
So why are you looking to sell such a unique car, Brendan?
Look, probably a bit of a change in lifestyle, I guess. My wife and I are looking to move locations as perhaps hopefully wind down towards retirement. So, unfortunately, I don't really want it to go, but it probably is. It probably is time.
Time for somebody else to enjoy it and dote on it
Yeah,
like you have.
yeah,
And
yeah. It'd be awesome for someone to buy it who knows something about them. And you do occasionally run into people who will come up to it if they see it and they do know a little bit about South African GTs. But there's still a lot of people out there, who say, what the heck is that? And I never ever knew that those GTs did go to over to South Africa. Hopefully your podcast, etc., can help to get that message out there as well, Stuart.
I just think they're unbelievable value compared to
They are.
the Falcon GTs of the same era that are on sale in
Yeah.
Australia today. And how many kilometers has your car done?
Oh, no idea, to be honest. It's showing about because that's another good point that separates them, in that they're all metric gauges over there, whereas the Aussie GTs, of course, were all in miles per hour.
That's right.
So these are in kilometers per hour. So it's something else that just makes them that little bit different.
And ahead of its time.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I think mine's showing about 67,000 kilometers, but that would be several times around, I would say.
With a car like this as well, I'd always look at the condition of it and buy
Yeah.
it based on the condition rather than what the odometer is
Yeah.
saying in any case.
100,
And you can see that this is
100%.
a beautiful car and been
Yeah,
well.
it's a nice car.
I guess the big question is, Brendan, how much are you asking for your XW Fairmont GT?
Look at Stuart. It's advertised for 105,000. I think it's definitely worth it. I don't think I'm asking too much for it, and I think probably given that there's probably still strong interest in the Aussie GTs. Probably not quite as strong as it was perhaps 5 years ago, pre-pandemic maybe, but there is still it is a price that to me has to still be attractive when compared with an Aussie GT in a similar condition, is probably it's probably half the price, really.
Yeah, look, I think you're being super reasonable with the price. I had a look on car sales, and yours is
Yeah,
the cheapest Fairmont GT on car sales by some fair margin. And I
yeah,
do think these South African GTs have some catching up to do. Like while the some of
yeah,
the heat might have come out of the Falcon GT market, the Australian cars, I
yeah,
think as more people learn about these South African Fairmont GTs, that they'll close the gap. They might not ever catch up with the Australian delivered cars, but I think that at that price, it's probably a fairly solid investment for
yeah,
someone.
absolutely. Yeah, and look, Stuart, I think hopefully your podcast will get help to get that message out there. To me, the Fairmont GTs are almost a win-win because they are definitely more affordable than the Aussie equivalent. Plus, they're something that's just a little bit different as well. So they're definitely a talking point over a cup of coffee at a car show. They generate a lot of interest, and they are still a genuine GT.
Yeah, as stated by Ford Australia themselves, they said it was an
Correct.
export Falcon GT. So, look, Brendan, I wish you all the best of luck with your sale. I hope
Thanks, Stuart.
podcast helps connect you with somebody, an enthusiast who will love and cherish the car and take it to
Thank you.
car shows and spread the enthusiasm out there. So, wish you all the best of luck.
Yeah, I really appreciate you asking me to come on to the podcast as well, Stuart. So I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks for joining us at Performance Car Lounge. If you have a performance car with an interesting story that you are selling, contact us at performancecarlounge.com.au.